The hum of the pinnacle was a low, predatory thrum. It was the sound of money breathing, a constant, air-conditioned sigh that circulated through the restaurant on the 95th floor of the Finch Tower. For Ilara Vance, 24 years old, and drowning in the quiet desperation of her generation, it was the sound of the cage. She served exquisitely arranged plates of food she could never afford to people whose lives were as alien as distant constellations, all while her own dream, a doctorate in urban architectural history, was being crushed under a mountain of student loans and her late mother's medical debt. But one customer was a different species of predator. Alistair Finch. He wasn't just a patron, he was the architect of this glass and steel prison, a titan of real estate whose name was branded on the building itself. His fortune was eclipsed only by his legendary coldness. His words were scalpels, his gaze an audit. Every dinner service he attended was a public execution of someone's dignity. What Ilara didn't know was that this man, this monument of glacial indifference, who seemed intent on grinding her spirit into dust, was bound to her by a secret, born in a dusty library and shattered by ambition over 2 decades ago. This is not merely a story of a waitress and a billionaire. It is the story of a city's soul, a mother's buried legacy, and the cataclysmic collision of past and future that will either annihilate them both or unearth the unbelievable truth of who she really is. The official scent of the pinnacle was a sterile fusion of truffle oil, Windex, and unspoken anxiety. It was a place that didn't just serve food, it curated experiences for a clientele who believed their net worth granted them immunity from basic human decency. For Ilara, it was the battlefield where she earned the money to keep the lights on in the cramped, book-filled apartment she had once shared with her mother, Lena. At 24, Ilara felt ancient. The spark in her deep brown eyes, a reflection of the passionate, intellectually curious woman her mother had raised, was often clouded by a bone-deep weariness. Lena had passed away 8 months prior, losing a quiet but vicious war with cancer. She had been a city archivist, a woman who found poetry in blueprints and history in foundation stones. She had bequeathed to Ilara a love for the past, a sharp, analytical mind, and a shoebox stuffed with what she called her Blackwood Project, research on a derelict downtown building. Now, Ilara was utterly alone, armed only with that box, a half-written thesis on post-war urban renewal, and a resilience that was being stress-tested to its breaking point. Her friend and fellow server, Marcus, a wiry, perpetually stressed-out acting student, caught her by the service station. "Heads up," he whispered, his eyes wide with a familiar dread. "Table 12. Finch is here, and he brought Julian Thorne." Ilara didn't have to ask who Finch was. The name hung in the air like a storm warning. Alistair Finch, CEO of Finch Global Properties, was a man who didn't just build skyscrapers. He erased history to do it. He saw landmark buildings not as cultural treasures, but as outdated liabilities occupying valuable square footage. He came to the pinnacle 3 times a week, not for the Michelin-starred cuisine he invariably found fault with, but to hold court in the monument to his own success. As Marcus theorized, Finch enjoyed reminding the world, and especially the little people who served him, that he was the master of his universe. The addition of Julian Thorne was a new, unsettling variable. Thorne was Finch's chief counsel, a man in his late 30s who was as sleek and polished as the tower itself. He was the public face of Finch Global, the smooth negotiator who pacified city councils and charmed preservation societies into submission. He was, in his own way, more dangerous than Finch. Finch was a sledgehammer. Thorne was the poisoned pen that signed the demolition orders. "Fantastic," Ilara muttered, tightening the knot on her black apron as if it were a piece of armor. She composed her face into a mask of professional neutrality, the one that didn't betray the frantic calculations of bills and deadlines happening behind her eyes, and picked up 2 leather-bound menus. Alistair Finch sat with his back to the panoramic view of the city he had so thoroughly conquered. His posture was unnaturally rigid, his silver and black hair sculpted with architectural precision. His custom suit was a shade of charcoal, so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. He was not speaking to Thorne. He was staring at the single white orchid in the center of the table, his expression one of profound disappointment, as if the flower had personally failed him. He was handsome in a severe, unforgiving way, with a jawline that looked like it was carved from granite and eyes the color of a frozen lake. "Good evening, Mr. Finch, Mr. Thorne. Welcome to the pinnacle," Elara said, her voice a carefully modulated instrument of polite deference. Finch did not acknowledge her. His gaze remained fixed on the orchid. "The petals are asymmetrical," he stated, not to her, not even to Thorne, but to the universe at large. "The left side has a slight curl, the right does not. It's distracting. Remove it." Julian Thorne offered Elara a flicker of a smile, a tiny, almost imperceptible gesture of apology. "Alistair appreciates balance," he said smoothly. "Of course, sir," Elara replied, her fingers steady as she lifted the slender vase from the table. It was a classic Finch opening gambit. Establish an impossible standard of perfection, and then punish the world for failing to meet it. She returned from the service station, the offending orchid now banished. "May I get you started with something to drink?" Finch finally shifted his icy gaze to her. It wasn't a look of recognition. It was one of assessment, the way one might inspect a tool for defects. Voss. Still not sparkling. 1 cube of ice, perfectly clear, cut from a block, not from a tray. And a sliver of lemon zest, not a wedge. The pith is bitter. "And for you, Mr. Thorne?" Elara asked, turning to the younger man. "Just tap water is fine, thank you," he said, earning a sharp, sideways glance from his boss. Elara returned with the drinks, having personally supervised the bartender's neurosurgical preparation of Finch's water. She set it down with a quiet grace. Finch picked up the glass, held it to the light to inspect the single, crystal-clear ice cube, and took a sip. "Adequate," he pronounced. The word was a concession, not a compliment. "Now, the Blackwood building. The final hearing is tomorrow. Are there any last-minute snags from the so-called Preservation Alliance?" Thorne opened his briefcase. "They filed another motion this morning, frivolous, citing unexamined historical significance. We'll have it dismissed by 10 a.m. The demolition permits will be signed by noon." Elara's blood went cold. The Blackwood building, her mother's project. The beautiful neglected Art Deco structure downtown that Finch wanted to replace with a 40-story glass box of luxury condos. She felt a proprietary, protective anger swell in her chest. Finch gave a grunt of satisfaction. Good. Sentimental fools. Clinging to decay and calling it history. The past is an anchor, Thorne. We move forward by cutting the rope. He finally deigned to look at the menu, scanning it for a few seconds before snapping it shut. The sea bass. Pan-seared. The skin must be crisp enough to create an audible crack when struck with a fork. If it is even remotely flaccid, I will send it back. The accompanying asparagus must be uniform in length and thickness. I don't want to see any variation. An excellent choice, sir, Elara said, the words feeling like gravel in her mouth. She retreated to the point-of-sale system, her fingers tapping the screen with more force than necessary. Marcus sidled up beside her. Did he demand you personally interview the fish to ensure it had a happy life? Close, Ilara sighed, leaning her forehead against the cool screen for a second. He specified the desired acoustics of its cooked skin. The man's a monster, Marcus said, shaking his head. Don't let him get to you. I'm trying, she whispered, but sometimes it feels targeted, like he looks at me and sees everything he holds in contempt. He looks at everyone like that, Ilara. It's not you. It's him. But Marcus was wrong. It felt personal, because his philosophy of destruction was a direct assault on everything her mother had taught her to value. Lena Vance believed that buildings held memories, that a city's character was written in its brick and mortar. Alistair Finch saw only a spreadsheet, a ledger of profit and loss where the past was always in the red. The sea bass was ready. Ilara carried the plate to the table, her focus absolute. The skin was a perfect, golden-brown shield. The asparagus spears were like green soldiers standing at attention. She placed it before him. He did not thank her. He picked up his fork and tapped the fish's skin. A faint, crisp tick was audible in the quiet restaurant. He nodded, a barely perceptible motion. He then took a bite, chewing with a deliberate, analytical slowness. Ilara held her breath. The fish is cooked correctly, he declared. He then used his fork to point at the asparagus. This, however, is a failure. He looked directly at her, his eyes devoid of emotion. The chef has used salted butter for the glaze. I can taste the specific mineral profile of industrially processed sodium chloride. It clashes with the natural salinity of the sea base. It's an amateur mistake. For a moment, Ilara was speechless. She stared at the gleaming asparagus, then back at his stony face. He wasn't being hyperbolic. He was genuinely, pathologically offended by the butter. I am very sorry to hear that, sir, she said, her professionalism a thin shield against the absurdity of the moment. Would you like me to have the chef prepare a new side for you? No, he said, waving his hand dismissively. The integrity of the dish is already compromised. Just be aware of your establishment's failings. He ate the rest of his meal in a tense silence, punctuated only by his low-voiced instructions to Thorne about the Blackwood demolition. Ilara avoided the table, her stomach churning with a mixture of anger and helplessness. When he was finished, he pushed his plate a precise 2 inches forward, the signal that he was ready for the check. She dropped it off wordlessly. He placed a sleek, black titanium credit card on the tray. When she returned with the slip, he took an ornate fountain pen from his jacket and signed with a flourish. He and Thorne stood, adjusted their jackets in near-perfect unison, and swept out of the restaurant, leaving a wake of cold air. Ilara walked to the table, a familiar sense of dread creeping over her. His tips were a form of psychological warfare. A few coins, sometimes a single $1. It was another tool of humiliation. She picked up the merchant copy of the receipt. The total was $472.50. On the tip line, he had drawn a bold, definitive 0, and beneath it, in sharp, architectural script, were 3 words: details matter. Pay attention. The ink seemed to scorch the paper. It wasn't just an insult, it was a verdict. It was a dismissal of her effort, her focus, her very existence. A hot, furious tear pricked the corner of her eye, and she angrily swiped it away, crushing the receipt in her fist. Don't even look at it, Marcus said, coming to clear the plates. It's just paper. But it wasn't. It was a message. And as Ilara smoothed the crumpled paper and stared at the cruel, elegant handwriting, a vow took root in the exhausted soil of her heart. One day, she thought, I'll save something you want to destroy. I'll build something you can't tear down. She had no idea that the battle for the Blackwood building was about to become inextricably linked with the battle for her own past, or that Alistair Finch had already destroyed something of hers she never even knew she had. The encounters with Alistair Finch became a grim, biannual ordeal, a recurring tax on her spirit. He always found a new, microscopic flaw to dissect. The soup was 2 degrees below its optimal serving temperature. The weave of the linen napkin was insufficiently tight. The ambient lighting cast a sallow hue upon his food. Each critique was delivered with the dispassionate air of a god finding fault in his flawed creation. Elara learned to armor herself with detachment, performing her duties with a robotic precision that offered no emotional surface for his attacks to grip. But beneath the calm exterior, her anger was crystallizing into a hard, cold resolve. One blustery November evening, he was particularly venomous. The restaurant was packed, the kitchen frantic. His steak, ordered medium rare with a charcoal crust and a cool red center, took 4 minutes longer than his usual 20. "Is the chef aging the beef personally?" he inquired without a hint of humor when she apologized for the delay. When the steak arrived, he sliced it open and declared the center tepid, not cool. He sent it back. The second steak was deemed acceptable, but he ate only half, stating that the momentum of the meal had been lost. He left no tip. The note on the receipt this time read, "Anticipate need. Do not react to it." That night, Elara walked home through the wind-whipped streets, Finch's words echoing in her mind. They were more than just the complaints of a demanding customer. They were a philosophy, a ruthless creed that celebrated foresight and condemned reaction. It was the same logic he applied to his business, tearing down old buildings because he anticipated future profit, dismissing the reactive, sentimental pleas of preservationists. His words were a judgment on her life, a life spent reacting, to debt, to grief, to him. She let herself into the apartment, the scent of old books, and her mother's faint, lingering perfume of lavender and paper, a comfort in the gloom. Most of Lena's belongings were gone, donated or stored. But the one thing Elara couldn't bring herself to touch sat on the highest shelf of her mother's closet, a heavy, archival-quality box labeled simply Blackwood. It was the culmination of Lena's personal obsession, years of research into the building Finch was so eager to destroy. "History isn't just in books, Elara," her mother used to say, her eyes alight with passion. "It's in the cornices, the floor plans, the ghosts that live in the walls. You have to know how to listen." Tonight, Finch's relentless dismissal of the past had ignited a fire in her. She needed to connect with her mother's legacy. She needed to listen. With a surge of purpose, she climbed a stepladder and carefully maneuvered the heavy box down. Dust motes danced in the lamplight as she lifted the lid. It wasn't a box of memories. It was an arsenal. Inside were meticulously organized files. There were copies of the original 1928 blueprints, architectural renderings, and photographs documenting the Blackwood's construction. There were newspaper clippings detailing its grand opening, its life as a prestigious hotel, and its slow decline. But beneath the formal research was another layer, bundled in faded red ribbon. It was personal. First, a slim journal. It was her mother's, from her early 20s, when she was a graduate student working part-time at the city archives. The entries were filled with a fierce, nerdy passion for her work, and a blossoming romance with a man she only ever referred to as A. Then came the photographs. A young, vibrant Lena, her dark hair a wild halo around her smiling face, stood beside a young man. He was shockingly handsome, with an intensity that burned through the old photograph. He had a sharp, ambitious jaw, and the same piercing, ice-blue eyes that Elara saw twice a week in her nightmares. He wasn't smiling, but he was looking at Lena with a raw, unguarded adoration that made Elara's breath catch in her throat. Who was he? Her mother had never spoken of a great love, never mentioned a man from her past with such significance. The narrative of her life had always been that she had wanted a child on her own, a story Elara had never had reason to doubt. She kept digging. At the very bottom of the box, wrapped in drafting paper, was a single, heavy object. It was an architect's fountain pen, vintage and elegant, made of sterling silver. Intricately engraved on the cap were two initials, entwined in a flowing script, L and A Ao. With trembling fingers, Elara returned to the journal, flipping through the pages, searching for the name that went with the initial. October 12th. I gave me the most beautiful pen today. He said it was for the brilliant archivist who is going to catalogue our future. He was laughing, but he meant it. He says one day his name will be on the tallest building in this city, and he wants my name on the cornerstone with him. His ambition is terrifying. It's like standing next to a furnace, but I can't seem to pull away from the heat. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. Ah, Alistair. It couldn't be. It was a monstrous, impossible coincidence. She scrambled back to the photographs, her hands shaking. She found the clearest image of the young man's face and held it under the light. She studied the severe cheekbones, the intense gaze, the uncompromising set of his mouth. Then, with a sense of rising horror, she pulled out her phone and typed Alistair Finch Young into the search bar. The screen illuminated with images. An article from a 30-year-old business journal appeared, headlined, Alistair Finch, the Young Turk of Urban Development. The black and white photo showed him accepting an award. He was older than in her mother's photos, his hair shorter, his expression harder. But it was him, unmistakably. The same man. The phone slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the wooden floor. Elara stared at the silver pen in her palm. L and A. Lena and Alistair. The air in the room grew thin. The walls seemed to close in. Alistair Finch, the cruel, pathologically precise billionaire who treated her like a piece of faulty equipment. The man whose entire philosophy was an insult to her mother's memory. The man she despised with a purity that felt elemental. She grabbed the journal again, her mind a maelstrom of denial and revulsion. She scanned the final entries, her eyes flying over her mother's neat script. May 21st. We had a terrible fight. He has a chance to buy out his partners, but he needs every cent. He called the Blackwood Project, my project, the one we started together, a sentimental distraction. He said the future is built on steel, not memories. He looked at me and said, love is a liability I can't afford right now. He was talking about the building, but it felt like he was talking about me. June 15th. It's over. He's gone. He chose the furnace. He said that to build an empire, you have to be willing to burn everything that holds you back. He never looked back. He left me in the ashes. There was no mention of a pregnancy. Elara frantically checked the dates. The breakup was in June. Her birthday was the following March. 9 months. The timeline was a brutal, perfect circle. Her mother must have discovered she was pregnant just after he left. And she had chosen to raise her daughter alone, to build a life from those ashes, never telling the man who had shattered her heart that he had left behind more than just a broken dream. A wave of nausea and a fierce, protective love for her mother crashed over her. Lena hadn't just been a single mother by circumstance. She had made a choice. She had shielded her daughter from the man who saw love as a liability. She had protected her from the furnace, The questions descended in a suffocating cloud. What happened to that young man in the photos? How did the man who adored her mother become the monster of Table 12? And the most terrifying question of all, the one that was now a scream in the center of her mind, was this man, her tormentor, her biological father? She sank to the floor, surrounded by the ghosts of a love story she never knew existed. The pure, simple hatred she felt for Alistair Finch was now hopelessly tangled with the most intimate connection of all. Her small, difficult life had just been fractured, revealing a truth so vast and horrifying it defied comprehension. And at the epicenter of the cataclysm was the face of the man she had to serve tomorrow. Sleep was a battlefield. Ilara's dreams were a chaotic newsreel of her mother's smiling face, dissolving into Alistair Finch's icy glare, of blueprints for skyscrapers burning to reveal her own infant photo, of his voice, low and cutting, repeating, "Details matter. Pay attention." She woke up feeling as though she'd been emotionally flayed, the raw reality of her discovery clinging to her like a shroud. "He is my father." The sentence felt like a lie, a piece of pulp fiction. A father was meant to be a foundation, a source of identity. Alistair Finch was a wrecking ball. The gulf between A, the passionate, furnace-hot young man in Lena's journal, and the cold, calculating tycoon who measured the symmetry of orchids, was an unbridgeable chasm. Her first impulse was to vanish. Quit her job, change her name, flee to a city where his name wasn't carved into the skyline. But flight was a privilege she couldn't afford. Her financial reality was a tightrope walk over an abyss. And so, she did the only thing a person on a tightrope can do. She took the next step. She went to work. The city looked different, sharper, more hostile. Every Finch tower she saw felt like a personal accusation. She was no longer just Ilara Vance, struggling graduate student and waitress. She was Ilara Vance, the secret, dispossessed heir to this cold, concrete kingdom. The thought was so grotesquely ironic, it bordered on madness. When she walked into the pinnacle, Marcus greeted her with his usual frantic energy. "Whoa, you look like you wrestled a ghost and lost." "Worse," she murmured, tying on her apron. It felt like a disguise, a role she no longer knew how to play. "I think the ghost is me." She couldn't tell him. The secret was a living, breathing creature in her chest, too monstrous and fragile to be spoken aloud. To give it voice would be to give it permanence. For the first few hours, she moved in a fugue state. She took orders, delivered food, cleared plates, her body on autopilot, while her mind endlessly reread her mother's journal. She saw it all now. Lena's quiet strength, her decision to erase Alistair not out of spite, but out of a fierce, maternal instinct to protect her child from his corrosive ambition. Lena had chosen a life of struggle and love over a life of wealth and emotional sterility. She had saved Ilara from him. The chime of the private elevator announced his arrival. Ilara's heart seized. Alistair Finch strode into the dining room, Julian Thorne at his side. He was no longer just a difficult customer. He was the man who had called her mother a distraction and walked away. He was the blank space in her own history. He took his seat at table 12. By a cruel twist of fate, it was in her section. There was no escape. Marcus caught her eye, his expression a question. "Want me to take it?" Ilara shook her head. A strange, steely resolve solidified within her. She had to do this. She had to face him, armed with the terrible, powerful truth. She walked toward the table, her legs feeling disconnected from her body. This time, she wasn't just seeing a billionaire bully. She was seeing the young man in the photograph, searching his face for any vestige of the person her mother had loved. The ice-blue eyes were the same, but the fire in them had been extinguished, replaced by a glacial hardness. The sharp jawline remained, but it was now set in a permanent expression of command. "Good evening, Mr. Finch," she said. Her voice was steady, a miracle of sheer willpower. He looked up, and for a split second, their eyes truly met. A current passed between them, a flicker of something other than the usual master-servant dynamic. Did he see something? A shadow of Lena in the shape of her face? A ghost in her eyes? No. His expression shuttered. The moment passed. "The usual," he said, already turning to Thorn. "Voss water." The specifics as previously articulated. As Elara walked away, she felt a hollow ache. She had hoped for, or perhaps dreaded, a sign, a spark of an unknown connection. There was nothing. To him, she was furniture. The knowledge poisoned the entire interaction. Every clipped command, every impatient sigh was no longer the rudeness of a stranger. It was the casual neglect of a father. His complaint that his ice cube was cloudy at its core felt like a rejection of her very DNA. When she brought him his main course, her hand trembled slightly. As she set the plate down, the edge of her thumb brushed against the warm porcelain. He recoiled, a minute but sharp movement. "Please be careful," he said, his voice laced with sharp annoyance. "I have no desire for your fingerprints to contaminate my meal." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Your fingerprints. The fingerprints of his own child. Something inside Elara, the part of her that had been absorbing his cruelty for months, the part that had been grieving her mother and her own lost history, finally fractured. The carefully constructed facade of the professional waitress didn't just crack, it disintegrated. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Instead, a terrifying calm descended upon her, a coldness that mirrored his own. She looked him directly in the eye. Her brown eyes, so much like her mother's, were not deferential or frightened. They were flat, hard, and knowing. "My apologies, sir," she said. Her voice was stripped of all its practiced warmth. It was clipped, precise, and utterly devoid of emotion. She turned on her heel and walked away. For the rest of his meal she was an automaton of perfect, icy service. She refilled his water from a distance, never speaking. She cleared his plates in a silence that was more profound than any noise. She was a presence, but she was no longer trying to placate him. She was no longer performing. Finch noticed. She felt his gaze following her as she moved through the dining room. His brow was creased in a slight, irritated frown. He was accustomed to her flustered attempts to meet his impossible standards. This new, cold defiance was an unexpected variable in his carefully controlled equation. It was an act of insubordination, so subtle he couldn't call it out, and it infuriated him. It was a detail he couldn't control. When he was finished, she placed the check on the table without a word. As he signed, he looked up at her one final time, a silent question in his cold eyes. "What has changed?" Elara met his gaze and held it, her expression a blank wall. For a long, charged moment, they were just a man and a woman, locked in a silent war, the vast, unspoken history between them, a palpable entity in the air. Then he looked away, scrawled his signature, and left. Elara walked to the table, her heart a cold, heavy stone. She knew there would be a 0 on the tip line. She didn't care. She was looking for the note. It was there, in the same sharp, angular script. A notable lack of engagement. Unacceptable. She didn't crumple the receipt. She folded it with precise, deliberate movements and slid it into her apron pocket. It was evidence. It was the final entry in her own journal of him. He demanded engagement, attention to detail, but had no idea that the silent, unengaged woman before him was the most significant detail of his entire life, a detail he had failed to notice for months. The irony was so bitter it tasted like poison. The following weeks unfolded as a strange, cold war. Ilara performed her duties with a chilling efficiency, a silent rebuke in every perfect placement of a fork. Alistair in turn watched her, his irritation visibly mounting. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. She was no longer his victim. She was his judge, and her silence was the verdict. The secret she held was a shield, and behind it she felt a tragic, untouchable power. Her life outside the pinnacle, however, was fraying at the seams. The emotional weight of her secret was crushing. She barely slept, spending her nights poring over her mother's research on the Blackwood, seeing it now not just as an academic project, but as a battleground for her mother's legacy. Her own thesis lay abandoned. Her grief for Lena was now intertwined with a white-hot rage at the man who had set the course of her mother's difficult life. Marcus knew something was fundamentally wrong. "Ilara, talk to me," he pleaded one night after a shift. "You're like a porcelain doll. You look perfect, but I'm afraid if I touch you, you'll shatter. Is it Finch? Did he finally break you?" "He can't break what's already broken," she deflected, the truth a shard of glass in her throat. "I'm just tired of the game." The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, the night of the final demolition appeal for the Blackwood building. The restaurant was hosting a private event for Finch Global Properties. It was a celebration, a preemptive victory party. The dining room was filled with city officials, investors and lawyers, all basking in the glow of Alistair Finch's power. Ilara, against her will, was assigned to the main party. She moved through the room like a ghost, her face a neutral mask as she served champagne and canapés to the very people who were about to rubber-stamp the destruction of her mother's legacy. Alistair was holding court, Julian Thorne at his side. He was expansive, almost charming in his victory. He raised his glass for a toast. "To the future," he began, his voice resonating with authority, "and to the bold vision required to build it. Tomorrow, we will take another step forward by removing a relic of the past. The Blackwood building, a monument to inefficiency and decay, will make way for progress. To those who would chain us to the past, who cry over every pile of old bricks, I say this: you cannot build a future if you are living in a museum." The crowd applauded, a sound that made Ilara's skin crawl. It was a eulogy for her mother's work, delivered by her mother's betrayer. Just then, a young busboy, a terrified-looking teenager named Leo on his first week, stumbled while navigating the crowded room. His tray tilted, and a single glass of champagne tumbled off, shattering on the marble floor at Finch's feet. A sudden, complete silence fell over the room. Leo turned ghost-white, stammering apologies. I'm so sorry, Mr. Finch. Sir, Finch didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He looked down at the shattered glass, then up at the trembling boy, and his voice was colder than the ice in his water. "What is your name?" he asked. "Leo, sir," the boy whispered. "Leo," Finch repeated, savoring the name. "You are a detail, Leo. A small, clumsy detail in an evening that was meant to be about precision and success. And you have failed. Your presence here is a flaw in the design." He turned his gaze to the restaurant manager, who was rushing over, his face a mask of horror. "Remove this flaw. I don't want to see him again." It was an execution, quiet, swift, and absolute. The manager, pale and sweating, grabbed the boy's arm and began pulling him toward the kitchens. "My deepest apologies, Mr. Finch. It will be handled." And that was it. A boy's job, his livelihood, incinerated on the altar of Alistair Finch's ego. Something inside Alara, the carefully contained dam of grief and rage and historical injustice, burst. It wasn't just about Leo. It was about her mother, cast aside as a liability. It was about the Blackwood building, dismissed as a pile of old bricks. It was about her own life of quiet struggle, while this man built an empire on the ruins of other people's lives. It was about the colossal, universe-sized irony of a man obsessed with details who had missed the single most important detail of his own story, the daughter standing 10 feet away from him. She set her tray of drinks down on a nearby table with a soft click. She untied her apron and let it fall to the floor. "Alara, what are you doing?" Marcus hissed from the service station. She ignored him. She walked through the silent, parted crowd directly toward Alistair Finch. He watched her approach, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes at this new interruption. Thorne took a half step forward, as if to intercept her, but she met his gaze with a look so fierce he stopped. She stood before Alistair Finch. She was no longer a waitress. She was Lena Vance's daughter. "Is there a problem?" Finch asked, his voice dripping with condescending boredom. "Yes," Alara said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and resonant, cutting through the silence of the vast room. "There is. You." A collective gasp went through the room. Finch's expression shifted from boredom to a dangerous, focused calm. "I believe you are forgetting your place." "No," Alara countered, her voice gaining strength. "I'm finally remembering mine. You stand here and you talk about the future. You talk about vision. But your vision is blind. You see buildings, but you don't see the history. You see floors, but you don't see the people." She took a step closer. "You just destroyed a young man's life over a broken glass because he was a flaw in the design. You want to demolish the Blackwood building because you see it as a relic. But you're wrong." Now her specialized knowledge, the knowledge her mother had given her, came pouring out. That pile of old bricks was designed by Eleanor McGee, one of the first licensed female architects in this state. It features a cantilevered steel support system that was revolutionary for its time and became the prototype for half the buildings erected in the next decade. Its terracotta facade was crafted by Italian artisans who inscribed their family names on the reverse side of the tiles on the 15th floor. It's not a relic, Mr. Finch. It's a cornerstone. She was no longer just a waitress. She was an academic, a historian, and she was giving a lecture. The investors and city officials were staring, captivated. Julian Thorne was looking at her with an expression of stunned disbelief and something that looked like dawning respect. Alistair was speechless, his face a mask of cold fury. "You talk about paying attention to details," Alara continued, her voice now trembling with a righteous, long-suppressed fury. "But the biggest details are the ones you miss, the human details, the ones that don't show up on a balance sheet." She paused, then delivered the final, devastating blow. "My mother taught me that. She taught me that a person's legacy isn't what they build, but what they choose not to destroy. Her name was Lena Vance. She was an archivist, and she loved that building. She would have told you that erasing the past isn't a sign of strength, it's an act of fear." The mention of the name, Lena Vance, hung in the air. It was a name he hadn't heard in 25 years. Alara saw it hit him. It wasn't a flicker of recognition this time. It was a seismic shock. His icy composure shattered. His face went slack with a confusion so profound it looked like pain. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. The shape of her face, the fierce intelligence in her dark eyes, the ghost of a woman he had once loved and deliberately forgotten. "You are fired," he finally managed to say, the words a guttural growl directed at the manager, but his eyes were locked on Ilara, searching, horrified. "You can't fire me," Ilara said, a bitter, triumphant laugh escaping her lips. "I quit." She turned her back on him, on the stunned crowd, on the life of servitude she had endured for so long. She walked out of the dining room, her head held high, leaving behind the wreckage of a victory party and the deafening silence of a man whose perfectly designed world had just been demolished by a single, impossible detail he had never seen coming. Alistair Finch returned to his penthouse, a sterile sanctuary of glass and silence. But for the first time, the silence was not peaceful. It was accusatory. The girl's words echoed in the cavernous rooms. Lena Vance. She loved that building. The name was a key, unlocking a room in his memory he had bricked up and plastered over for a quarter of a century. Lena, the brilliant, passionate archivist who saw stories in stone, the woman whose warmth had been the only real fire in his life before his ambition consumed everything. He had left her. He had told himself it was a strategic necessity, a calculated sacrifice for the empire he was determined to build. He had called her a distraction. Now, her ghost had just confronted him in the guise of a waitress. And her eyes. That defiant fire. It was Lena's fire. He sat in a monolithic leather armchair that cost more than a car, the sprawling city lights glittering below like a carpet of conquered jewels, and felt nothing but a cold, creeping dread. The girl's outburst was not just insubordination, it was a reckoning. The next morning, his formidable executive assistant, Evelyn Hayes, a woman who had managed his life with unflappable efficiency for 15 years, entered his office. "Good morning, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice crisp. "The Blackwood demolition is scheduled for—" "Cancel it," he said, his voice flat. Evelyn stopped, her pen hovering over her tablet. "Sir, the contracts are signed, the crews are on standby." I said cancel it, indefinitely. He turned from the window to face her. "I need you to find someone. The waitress from last night. The one who was disruptive." Evelyn's professional mask was perfect, but he saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "The one you had terminated?" "May I ask why?" "I want to know who she is," he said, the excuse sounding hollow even to him. He didn't just want to know. He had to know. The possibility that was taking root in his mind was so monstrous, so world-altering, that he needed to see it in black and white. "Her name?" Evelyn asked. He hesitated, the name she had spoken aloud still a raw wound in his mind. He couldn't say it. "I don't know her first name. Her last name is Vance." "I'll get right on it, sir." Less than an hour later, Evelyn returned. She stood before his desk, her expression carefully, unnervingly neutral. She placed a single file folder on the polished mahogany. "Well?" he prompted, his voice tight. "Her name is Ilara Vance," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "She is 24 years old. She's a doctoral candidate in architectural history at City University. Her thesis is on post-war urban renewal." She paused. She has no living immediate family. Her mother, Lena Vance, a former city archivist, passed away 8 months ago from ovarian cancer. The world tilted. The air rushed from his lungs. 24 years old. He did the math, his mind, usually a fortress of cold logic, now a clumsy, frantic mess. 25 years ago, he had left Lena. The timeline was a death sentence to his ignorance. "My mother taught me." It wasn't a figure of speech. It was a direct quote. He was her father. The girl whose dignity he had systematically dismantled. The girl whose service he had critiqued with surgical cruelty. The girl whose mother's legacy he was about to bulldoze was his own flesh and blood. The guilt was a physical entity, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. He had built an empire of glass and steel, but his foundation was rotten. He had spent his life moving forward, cutting the rope to the past, and in doing so, he had severed himself from the only part of his life that had ever truly mattered. He hadn't just lost Lena. He had abandoned their child. And then, through a stroke of cosmic, cruel irony, he had found her again, only to become her tormentor. "Get me her address," he commanded, his voice a ragged whisper. "Sir, given the circumstances of her termination, now Evelyn," he thundered, his composure shattering into a million pieces. Meanwhile, Ilara was in her apartment, surrounded by the comforting chaos of her mother's books and research. Marcus had come over, bringing coffee and a fierce, protective energy. She had told him everything, the words pouring out in a torrent of grief and disbelief and rage. "So he's—" "Wow," Marcus said, sinking onto a pile of journals. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice small. She held the silver fountain pen, the cool metal, a tangible link to a story she was still struggling to comprehend. "I stood up for my mum. I stood up for the building. That's all I know right now." A sharp, authoritative knock echoed from her apartment door. It wasn't the tentative knock of a neighbor. It was a summons. "Are you expecting anyone?" Marcus asked. Ilara shook her head. She crept to the door and peered through the peephole. Her blood turned to ice. Alistair Finch stood in the dingy, poorly lit hallway of her building. He looked utterly alien, a creature of refined steel and tailored wool, stranded in a world of scuffed linoleum and peeling paint. He looked smaller than he did in his restaurant, smaller than he did in his tower. He looked broken. "Ilara, who is it?" Marcus called out. "It's him," she breathed, stumbling back from the door. He knocked again, louder this time. "Ilara, Miss Vance, please, I need to speak with you." His voice was stripped of its arrogance. It was raw, strained, pleading. Marcus stood up, his wiry frame tensed. "Want me to tell him to get lost?" Ilara's mind screamed. Yes. Yes, bolt the door, call the police, make the monster go away." But her heart, a foolish, traitorous organ, whispered something else. This was it. This was the moment of impact, the collision she had unknowingly been moving toward her entire life. "No," she said, her voice barely audible. "Let him in." She took a deep breath and opened the door. Alistair Finch stood before her, his ice-blue eyes, a maelstrom of emotions she had never seen in him, regret, desperation, and a profound, soul-deep shame. He looked at her, truly looked at her, his gaze tracing the features of her face as if memorizing a map. He wasn't looking at a waitress. He was looking for Lena. "You have her eyes," he breathed, the words thick with 25 years of unspoken grief. The dam inside Ilara finally broke. "My eyes?" she shot back, her voice choked with tears she refused to let fall. "I have her resilience too, the strength to build a life without you, the strength she had when you walked away and called her a liability." He flinched as if she had physically struck him. "I didn't know," he said, his voice ragged. "Lena never told me. I swear on her memory, Ilara. I never knew you existed." "And if you had," she challenged, the pain of a lifetime of absence packed into the question, "would I have been just another sentimental distraction? Another detail to be managed and dismissed?" "No," he said, his voice cracking. "God, no, it would have changed everything." His gaze fell upon the open box on her floor, the blueprints, the photos, her mother's journal. His eyes landed on the silver fountain pen she was clutching in her hand. He reached into his own breast pocket and pulled out a worn leather case. From it, he produced a matching pen. His half of the set. He had kept it all these years. The sight of that pen, more than any words, undid her. It was tangible proof of the story, of the connection, of the love that had been her genesis. "She told me you were a ghost," Elara whispered, the anger draining out of her, leaving only a vast, hollow sadness. She never said a bad word. She just erased you. I think she was trying to protect me. "She was protecting you from me," Alistair said, his eyes filled with a self-loathing that was terrible to behold. "And she was right. The man I became. The man in that restaurant." He couldn't finish. He looked around her small, book-filled apartment, at the evidence of a life forged not just without his wealth, but in direct opposition to his values. "What I did to you, Elara, the things I said, there is no apology that can cover it. There are no words." The apology hung in the air, inadequate and yet devastatingly sincere. Elara didn't know what to say. There was no script for this moment, when your villain is revealed to be your father, standing broken in your living room, begging for a forgiveness he has no right to ask for. "I think you should go," she said finally, her voice flat with emotional exhaustion. He looked crushed, but he nodded slowly. "I understand." He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. "Elara, your mother. Lena. She was the best part of me. And I threw it away. Don't make my mistake. Don't throw away your passion. That building. Save it." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hall until there was only silence. Elara sank onto the floor, the tears finally coming, a flood of grief for her mother, for herself, for the father she never had, and the man he had become. It wasn't an ending. It wasn't a reunion. It was the beginning of a long, painful excavation of the ruins he had left behind. Alistair Finch did not try to contact her again directly. The silence was a form of respect. 2 weeks later, a formal letter arrived from Julian Thorne's office. It stated that Finch Global Properties was withdrawing its demolition permit for the Blackwood building and was donating the property, along with a substantial endowment for its restoration, to a newly formed entity, the Lena Vance Preservation Trust. The letter concluded by offering the position of executive director of the trust to Elara Vance. It wasn't an apology made of words, but of action. It was the only language he knew. Elara met with Thorne a week later in his office, a space as intimidatingly sleek as the man himself. "He's a difficult man, Miss Vance," Thorne said, his professional demeanor softened by a hint of genuine empathy. "His entire life has been about control. What you did in that restaurant, you took that away from him. You showed him a detail he'd missed for 24 years. It changed him." "People like him don't change, Mr. Thorne," Elara said, though a part of her wanted to believe it wasn't true. "Perhaps not," Thorne conceded, "but they can be made to confront the consequences of their actions. He knows he can't buy your forgiveness. This trust, it's his attempt to honor your mother, and to give you the resources to pursue the work you were clearly born to do." Elara accepted the position. It was a victory that was entirely her own, built on her mother's legacy and her own courage. The work was her true inheritance. Her relationship with Alistair remained a fragile, complex thing. They began to meet, not for dinner in his tower, but for quiet walks through the city's historic districts. He didn't offer fatherly advice. He asked questions. He asked about her mother, about her childhood, about her research. He listened, for the first time in his life, not to find flaws, but to understand. He told her about the young man he had been, the one who shared dreams with her mother in dusty archives before the fear of failure had calcified into a ruthless need for success. They were two strangers, bound by blood and a shared loss, carefully mapping the geography of their fractured family. Months later, Ilara stood across the street from the Blackwood building, now draped in scaffolding, the sounds of careful restoration work echoing from within. Alistair stood beside her, not in a suit, but in a simple cashmere sweater, looking less like a titan and more like a mound searching for his place in the world. "She would have loved this," he said, his voice quiet. She always saw the beauty in things other people had discarded. He looked at Ilara, his ice-blue eyes holding a warmth she was slowly getting used to. She saw it in me once. A story that began with the casual cruelty of a $0 tip in a soulless restaurant found its fragile hope in the shadow of a saved building. Ilara and Alistair's journey is a testament that our lives are not just the stories we are told, but the ones we have the courage to uncover and rewrite. It proves that redemption is not a single, grand gesture, but the slow, arduous work of rebuilding, brick by brick, what was once destroyed. Their story was far from over, but for the first time, it was a future they were beginning to build together.